Fat girl abandoned. In snow by family, mountain man found her and said, "You're coming with me." "Put her where she belongs," her father said, voice flat as a cleaver. "With the pigs." Copper Ridge's harvest fair held its breath. Banners snapped, fiddles faltered, and 100 curious faces tilted toward the makeshift platform where Esther Pemberton stood, trembling beneath a lace parasol that was never made for shelter, only for show. Flower boys with burlap aprons smirked. Ladies with feathered hats hid their laughter behind fans. Her mother, Constance, sharp as a hatpin and twice as cruel, paraded Esther like a ruined cake, circling her with words sugared in venom. 24 and still unwanted, Constance declared. I fed her, clothed her, carried her shame. Tell me, Copper Ridge, who'll carry it now? Someone in the crowd shouted what others were already thinking. The sty's that way. Laughter broke like glass. Esther flinched, clutching the parasol handle until the wood bit her palm. She wasn't stupid. She knew how they saw her. Too broad for corsets, too soft for ballrooms, too generous of heart for the kind of town that measured worth in inches and ounces. She searched for her father's eyes and found only a ledger's emptiness. 2 brothers, hers by blood, strangers by kindness, unhooked the pen latch at the fair's edge. The squeal of it cut through her. Mud churned with straw and sour water. Pigs scattered, eyes bright and nervous. Constance lifted her chin. "Step down, Esther." "I can walk," Esther whispered, though shame buckled her knees. Richard Pemberton didn't wait. His hand struck her shoulder. The parasol flew. She fell hard, the sty's cold swallowing her skirts, the crowd's cheer rising like a storm. Someone tossed a rotten apple. It burst against her sleeve, sweet rot seeping. Children screamed for more. A farmhand snapped a photo, trapping the moment in tin forever. "Leave her," Richard said, already bored. "Let her learn," Constance added, as if cruelty were schooling. The gate clanged. The laughter thinned into murmurs, then drifted back to ribboned pies and blue ribbon hogs, because spectacle is only special until the next tune starts. Esther knelt in filth, breath ragged. Somewhere a hymn began on the church green, words about mercy floating where none could be found. A shadow slid across the sty. Not the sun. This shape carried its own weather. A man, tall and rough-hewn, with a trail-worn coat and a beard the color of ironwood bark, stepped through the ring of onlookers as if pushing aside pine boughs. His eyes, storm-sober, mountain-steady, took in the mud, the girl, the gate, the father. He did not ask permission. "Open it," he said, quiet enough to make the nearest men swallow. When no one moved, he reached down, caught the latch, and lifted. The hinge screamed. He stepped into the sty, and the pigs made way. He didn't offer a hand like a gentleman. He offered an arm like a bridge. "You're coming with me," he told Esther, as if stating a fact about the weather. The words fell into her like heat. If you're listening in Saigon or Seattle, Manila or Madrid, where are you hearing this from tonight? Tell me in the comments. Because what happens next isn't just about a fair, a family, or a sty. It's about the first person who refuses to look away. Esther had learned to make herself smaller in a world that measured women like bolts of fabric. She wore colors that disappeared into wallpaper, stitched her own frocks with generous seams meant for comfort rather than admiration, and kept her voice the way one keeps a diary, close to the chest, guarded by buttons. She was not delicate, she was substantial, a body built to lift sacks of flour and cradles of wood, a heart built to outlast winters. But the town did not have a word for that kind of beauty. Copper Ridge only had mirrors, and its mirrors always seemed to belong to someone else. She had the sort of face that brightened when she laughed and dimmed when she remembered to be afraid. A dimple hid in her left cheek like a secret she almost trusted the world with. Her hair was a heavy braid, the same dark as soil after rain. Today, the braid was streaked with mud. Today, she pretended not to hear the new boy at the apothecary chant, "Pig, pig, pig," as if the syllable could summon a spell strong enough to undo a person. The fair had always promised a kind of forgetting. Pies, ribbons, fiddlers, a tent full of seed catalogs and new harvest tools. Esther had come every year to watch the quilting ladies swap patterns and to sneak one sweet cinnamon donut when no one was counting. But this year she had been counted, tallied, weighed, sold to the cruel math of a mother who believed a daughter must pay for existing outside the narrow arithmetic of fashion. Constance Pemberton admired any surface that reflected her back at an angle she liked. She organized charity luncheons that cost more than the sums they raised, scolded seamstresses for the crime of suggestion, and spoke of breeding as if children were stables and marriages were parades. Beside her, Richard stood with hands behind his back like a magistrate unwilling to look at the gallows his verdict demanded. The Pemberton sons had their mother's jaw and their father's spine, sharp and hollow, respectively. The mountain man, no one spoke his name yet, had the look of a man who owned nothing he couldn't carry and carried everything that mattered. His coat held the memory of weather. His boots knew distances other men only guessed at. The townsfolk knew him as a rumor that walked. Some said he once dragged a wounded mustanger 5 miles through snow. Others swore he slept with his back against a pine and woke to a grizzly's breath, tangling his beard, and lived. What they agreed on was simpler. He wasn't theirs. He crouched in the sty as if kneeling at an altar, letting the stink and jeers slide off him like rain from rock. "Easy now," he said, and Esther heard a timbre she had never heard from men who wore cologne, an old wood gentleness. She tried to stand, and her skirt suctioned to the muck, the suction like a hand refusing to let go. He didn't rush her. He peeled her free with patience, one palm against her shoulder blade, the other bracing her elbow. When she wobbled, he offered no pity, only a steadying presence, as if balance were a thing that could be lent and returned. "Caleb," someone whispered from the back of the ring, the name traveling like a ripple, Caleb Stone. The syllables fit him, plain and durable. "Put her down," Richard snapped, the order brittle. "She's ours." Caleb looked up, not to argue, but to consider whether the speaker mattered. "She's a person," he said, and the truth of it carried a weight the law seldom does. "And she's leaving." Constance laughed the way a door laughs when it slams. "With you? A hermit who drags his knuckles across the wilderness? Be serious." "I am," Caleb said, and Esther felt the steadiness in him like a post sunk deep into ground that frost couldn't heave. He shrugged off his coat, thick, worn, smelling faintly of smoke and pine resin, and draped it around Esther's shoulders. The lining was warm. It swallowed the worst of the damp and hid the torn places in her bodice. She kept her eyes down, because if she looked up, she might cry. And there are tears the world deserves to see, and tears it will only weaponize. He angled his body between her and the crowd, turning gossip into wind. The sheriff hovered at the edge of things, calculating. Copper Ridge's law had a habit of waiting to see which way the money would blow before calling it a breeze. He caught Constance's look and cleared his throat. "No trouble here, Mr. Pemberton," he murmured, meaning, "Not yet, not unless it pays." Esther's legs shook. She had not stood at this height, upright, exposed, refusing to bend, in longer than she could remember. She thought about the doughnut she hadn't eaten this year, the cinnamon that would have left a sugared crescent on her thumb, the simple, ordinary sweetness of being nobody's entertainment. She tried to step and felt the sticky pull of mud again. Caleb adjusted his stance. "On 3, he said, voice for her alone. "1." He didn't give her 2 or 3, just lifted at the count of her breath, and somehow that was kinder. They cleared the gate. The crowd made a path because they always do, for spectacle and for endings. A camera in a boy's hands clicked once more, then lowered, because even cruelty has the sense to dim itself when it meets something older than it is. Constance reached, nails flashing. "You will not embarrass this family further," she said, which meant, "You will not escape the narrative I wrote for you." Esther stopped. For a heartbeat, the fair went quiet enough to hear the far church bell mark an hour she would remember for the rest of her days. She turned her head, not to her mother, not to her father, but to Caleb. He did not touch her. He only inclined his head as if to say, "You choose." "I'm not your shame," Esther said, and the words surprised her with how right they felt in her mouth. She faced forward before the courage cooled. Caleb guided her through the parted sea of townsfolk toward the hitching rail. A roan gelding stood there with a patient eye and a mane rough as rope. Caleb set a hand to the pommel, braced a boot, and made a step of his thigh so she could mount without the scramble that would please the watchers. She moved as if learning a new verb for the first time. He swung up behind, a wall of heat in the cold, and gathered the reins. Richard found his voice late. "You'll pay for this," he barked, the threat already shrinking. "I already did," Caleb said, and though no coin changed hands, anyone listening carefully heard the cost in him. They rode, past the pie tent where cinnamon spun in the air, past the quilting frames where bright squares of cloth waited to become something warmer, past the seed salesman's clapboard stall where next spring's promises were catalogued in painted packets. The fair resumed behind them, because fairs always resume. Ribbons must be pinned, judges must be consulted, children must be shushed and then unshushed. But a line had been drawn in Copper Ridge, a clean cut between those who laughed and the one who stepped into the sty. On the ridge above town, the wind changed, cooler and cleaner. Esther pulled the coat tighter, felt the weight of its seams, the stubbornness of its stitches. It felt like the first honest garment she had owned. She did not know where the road ended, or what a cabin in the timber smelled like after rain, or whether a life could be made from the scraps left to you. She only knew that for the first time since girlhood, no one was telling her what shape she had to be. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. The mountains ahead did the speaking for him, old, exact, and patient. He steered toward them as if toward a fact. The road out of Copper Ridge turned from dust to shale before it met the first pines. Behind them, the fair's noise dimmed until it was nothing more than a ghost of laughter carried on the wind. The smell of roasted corn and cider vanished, replaced by pitch, cold stone, and the iron scent of coming rain. Esther didn't speak. Her hands clutched the front of Caleb's coat, the rough wool scratching her knuckles, her heart beating as though it feared being heard. The horse's gait was steady, deliberate, almost gentle. She could feel the rise and fall of his breathing against her back, the kind of rhythm that told her he wasn't a man who hurried without reason. After an hour, her voice found its way through the fear. Where are we going?" "Home," Caleb said simply. "Up the mountain." The word home startled her. It had never belonged to her before, not truly. Her parents' house had been all chandeliers and polished silence, a museum of expectations. This man's voice, low and rough, made the word sound like a promise. The slope grew steeper. Trees crowded close, their needles whispering overhead. A hawk's cry cut the air, sharp and lonely. Esther tried not to think of the faces left behind, the smirks, the laughter, the click of the camera. She'd been turned into a story before she even had a chance to write her own. Now she rode through the only kind of silence that didn't judge her. At a narrow bend, Caleb slowed the horse and glanced back. "You holding up?" "I'm fine," she lied, though her body ached, and her stomach had begun to twist from hunger. He nodded, as if he could taste the truth beneath her words. "We'll stop by the creek ahead. Horse needs water. You'll eat." True to his word, he led her to a small clearing beside a ribbon of icy stream. He dismounted first, then reached up a hand to help her down. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His palm was warm, calloused, steady as the mountain itself. When her boots touched the ground, her knees gave a little. Caleb caught her elbow before she fell. "Easy now," he said. "You've been through hell. The ground takes some getting used to again." She wanted to tell him she was used to falling, that it was standing upright that felt strange, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she let him guide her to a fallen log where she sat, watching him unpack a small bundle from his saddlebag. Inside was dried venison, hard bread, and a tin flask. "Eat slow," he said, breaking a piece of bread and handing it to her. "Too fast, and you'll make yourself sick." The first bite was small, careful. Even the tough meat tasted like mercy. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Caleb poured her a cup of water from the stream. "Because I was there," he said, "and no one else moved." She looked up. "But you don't know me." "I don't have to. What they did was wrong. That's enough." The way he said it, without hesitation, without pity, made her chest ache. She took another bite, slower this time. He leaned against a pine trunk, arms folded, eyes on the darkening sky. "You live alone?" she asked after a while. "Mostly. Got a cabin by the lake, couple miles more." "Doesn't it get lonely?" He thought about that for a moment. "You get used to your own noise," he said, "but it's quieter than people's cruelty." She looked down at the cup in her hands, at her reflection trembling on the surface. "I don't think I'll ever get used to quiet again, not after—" She stopped herself. The rest of the sentence was still too sharp to touch. Caleb didn't press. He only said, "You don't have to tell me, not tonight." When they resumed the ride, night was already climbing the ridges. The stars came first in ones and twos, then spilled across the sky like spilled sugar. A wind carried the smell of pine smoke from somewhere far off. Esther pulled the coat tighter around her, its weight reminding her of the man behind her. Silent, constant, a wall between her and the cold. She must have drifted into half-sleep because the next thing she knew, the horse had stopped. Caleb's voice broke through the dark. "We're here!" The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, its surface black and gleaming under the moonlight. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and snow lay thick on the roof. It wasn't large or fine, but it looked solid, like the kind of place that wouldn't give up easy. A small corral stood nearby, half buried in snow. The only sound was the soft creak of trees swaying. Caleb dismounted, then lifted her down without a word. Her legs wobbled again, and once more his arm steadied her. "Inside," he said. "It's warm?" When she stepped over the threshold, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Wood smoke, pine, and something faintly sweet. Dried apples hanging from a string above the stove. A fire glowed in the hearth, casting light across rough-hewn furniture and shelves lined with tools. A quilted blanket, clearly made by a woman's hand, lay folded over the back of a chair. "Sit by the fire," Caleb said. "You're shaking." She did. The heat stung at first, then seeped in deep. He moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, setting a kettle on the stove, tossing another log into the fire, removing his gloves. She watched him. Broad shoulders, movement slow and sure, like he'd built this place one board at a time. Finally, she found her voice. "You don't have to keep me here. I can leave in the morning." He turned toward her, eyes steady beneath the firelight. "You're not leaving tonight," he said. "You'd freeze before sunrise. You'll stay until you're strong again. Then you can decide where to go." There was no force in his tone, only certainty. For the first time in years, no one was telling her what to do for their own convenience. It was for her safety. The difference felt strange, almost unbearable. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb poured her a cup of hot broth from the kettle. "Don't thank me yet," he said, sitting across from her. "This mountain tests everyone. If you're staying a while, you'll have to learn its ways." She met his gaze, her voice small but steady. "Then teach me." He nodded once. "Tomorrow." Outside, the wind howled across the lake. Inside, the cabin held its warmth. Esther sipped the broth, the taste simple but rich. Her hand still trembled, but this time not from cold. For the first time since she could remember, she felt something that resembled safety. Not comfort, not yet, but the faint, miraculous beginning of it. Morning came slowly in the mountains. Sunlight didn't rise. It crept, cautious and cold, filtering through frost-rimmed windows and catching the curl of smoke above the fire. When Esther opened her eyes, she didn't know at first where she was. The room smelled of wood and wool, of something cooking, coffee maybe, or oats. And for a moment she thought she had dreamed everything. Then she saw the coat folded over a chair, the boots drying by the hearth, and the broad back of the man who had carried her away from Copper Ridge. Caleb was stirring a pot at the stove, moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had done every task 1,000 times. Outside, wind pressed against the walls but didn't enter. The logs were thick, the seams tight. The world might have been ending out there, but in here it was simply morning. He looked over his shoulder when he heard her shift on the cot. "You're awake?" "Yes," she said softly. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." "You needed it. Food's ready." He poured oatmeal into 2 tin bowls and brought one to her. Steam rose between them. She cupped the bowl in both hands, grateful for the heat, though she barely knew what to say. No one had ever cooked for her just to be kind. "Thank you," she murmured. "Eat before it cools," he said. Then, after a pause, "There's coffee, too, strong enough to wake the dead." The first spoonful was plain and warm and perfect. It tasted like survival. Caleb ate quietly across from her, not staring, not avoiding her either, just present. That, she thought, was his way. to occupy space without filling it with noise. When they finished, he stood and pulled on his coat. "I'll chop wood before the snow softens. There's a spare coat by the door if you want to step outside." She hesitated, then said, "I could help." He raised an eyebrow. "You ever split a log?" "No," she admitted, "but I could learn." He considered her for a long moment, then handed her a pair of mittens. "All right, but stay clear of the axe till I say otherwise." Outside, the air bit her skin, sharp and clean. The lake was still frozen, the surface shining like glass. Pines stood heavy with snow, bowing as if in prayer. Caleb set a log upright on the chopping block and brought the axe down in one clean motion. The crack echoed like thunder in the stillness. Esther jumped despite herself. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, resetting the next piece. "Wood's dry. It sings when it splits." She watched him for a while, memorizing the motion, the lift, the turn, the precise fall of steel. There was grace in it, and purpose. When he paused, she said, "May I try?" He hesitated, then nodded and handed her the axe. It was heavier than she expected. Her arms trembled slightly as she raised it. Caleb stepped behind her, his hands over hers to adjust her grip. "Don't fight it," he murmured. "Let the weight do the work." His breath touched her ear, warm against the cold. She swallowed hard and brought the blade down. It hit off-center, barely nicking the wood. She frowned, tried again. On the third strike, the log cracked clean in two. "There you go," he said, and there was something like pride in his voice. "You'll get the feel for it." They worked until their breath fogged thick in the air and her shoulders burned pleasantly. When they stacked the last of the split wood against the cabin wall, Caleb brushed snow from his gloves. "That'll keep us warm another week," he said. "Come inside before you turn blue." She smiled, small but real. "You mean before you run out of patience watching me miss half the logs?" He huffed a short laugh. "You learn faster than most." Inside, the cabin grew cozier by the hour. Esther took to cleaning what little dust there was, folding the quilts, scrubbing the tin plates until they gleamed. She found an old bundle of dried herbs hanging near the stove, mint, sage, yarrow, and used them to brew tea that filled the room with a soft, clean scent. When Caleb returned from checking his traps, he stopped in the doorway and blinked as though he'd stepped into another world. "Didn't know the place could look this decent," he said. She laughed quietly. It just needed a woman's touch. "Or maybe it just needed someone who cared enough to bother," he said, setting down the rabbits he'd caught. "You've made it different. Feels lived in again." That night, they ate stew together. The meat was tender, the vegetables sweet. Esther had sewn a tear in the curtain earlier that day, and now the fabric rippled faintly in the draught, a patch of faded blue against the timber walls. Little by little, the cabin was beginning to feel less like exile and more like refuge. After supper, Caleb reached for a small wooden box on the mantel. He opened it, took out a harmonica, and began to play. A tune slow and haunting, the kind that belongs to long roads and empty skies. Esther sat quietly, hands wrapped around her cup, listening. The melody wound its way through the rafters, fragile as candlelight. When he stopped, she whispered, "That was beautiful." "Rebecca used to say that," he said, voice almost too low to hear. She looked at him, but he didn't explain further. The name hung between them, a ghost neither tried to chase away. Instead, she said softly, You must have loved her very much. He nodded. Still do. They sat in silence after that, the fire snapping gently. Outside, the wind moved across the lake like a slow sigh. Days bled into weeks. Snow thawed, then froze again. Esther learned to mend traps, to bake bread in the iron pot, to wash clothes in melted snow. Caleb showed her how to follow deer tracks, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way birds fell quiet. At first, they spoke little, she from shyness, he from habit. But the silences grew companionable, filled with the small sounds of work, the scrape of a knife, the whisper of fabric, the rhythm of breathing. One evening, as she stirred stew over the fire, Caleb said, "You've changed this place." She glanced up. "How so?" "It used to be just walls and tools. Now it's a home." She smiled, stirring slower. Maybe it was always waiting for someone to remind it how. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. Maybe it was waiting for both of us. The words settled in the air, fragile and true. Esther felt warmth rise to her face that had nothing to do with the fire. She turned back to the pot, pretending to taste the broth. Later, as snow began to fall again, she stood at the doorway watching the flakes drift through lamplight. Caleb joined her, silent. The mountain seemed endless and alive, breathing around them. She spoke without thinking. "It's strange. I used to think I'd never belong anywhere. But here, it feels like the world finally stopped pushing me out." Caleb's gaze stayed on the dark tree line. "The world's wrong more often than it's right," he said. "All a person can do is make their own corner of it right." She looked at him, at the scars on his knuckles, the gentleness behind his rough voice. "Maybe that's what this place is," she said. "Our corner." He met her eyes then, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Respect first, then understanding, then a faint, dangerous spark of tenderness. "Get some rest," he said after a moment, stepping back into the cabin. "Tomorrow we haul water before the stream freezes over." She nodded, though she stayed by the door a while longer, letting the snow land on her hair. Somewhere deep inside her, a thought she didn't dare name began to bloom. That night, when she finally lay down, the fire burned low, throwing soft amber light across the walls. Caleb's shadow moved near the hearth as he added one last log. She watched him quietly, the steady curve of his shoulders, the patience in every motion. He glanced her way, and for a second their eyes met. The brief, wordless recognition of two people who had been alone too long and had just begun to remember what warmth felt like. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something else was beginning to take root, slow as winter, sure as spring. The thaw came late that year. March crawled over the mountains like a tired traveler, and when the lake finally began to crack its mirror of ice, Caleb said it sounded like thunder underfoot, a reminder that even frozen things remembered how to move. By then, Esther knew the rhythms of the cabin as if she had been born to them. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire, fed the hens they'd traded for in a nearby valley, swept the floor until it gleamed. Caleb had stopped saying you don't have to. He had learned that she did these things not from obligation, but because it steadied her. Each chore was a piece of order carved from the chaos she had fled. Still, the peace had edges. Sometimes, when she sat by the lake, she saw her reflection ripple and almost didn't recognize the woman there. Cheeks fuller with health, eyes clearer, hands stronger. but the old wounds whispered beneath the surface. She would wake in the night to echoes of laughter, of mud, of her father's voice saying, "She's ours." Then she'd hear the low hum of Caleb's breathing near the fire, steady as the tide, and she'd remember where she was. Caleb, for his part, carried ghosts of his own. She caught him some nights on the porch, pipe unlit, staring toward the dark ridge where Rebecca was buried. Once she asked, "Do you ever go there?" He nodded. "When the ground softens enough. I bring flowers." She liked wild asters. Esther hesitated. "Would you take me with you next time?" He studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "If you wish." When the day came, the climb was steep but short. Rebecca's grave lay in a small clearing overlooking the valley. A simple wooden cross marked the spot, weathered smooth by wind and snow. Esther knelt, brushing pine needles from the soil. She set down a handful of fresh blossoms she'd gathered, purple and white, trembling in the cold air. "I didn't know you," she whispered, "but I think I owe you more than I can say." Caleb stood a few paces behind, hat in hand. "She would have liked you," he said. "You've got the same stubbornness." "Is that a compliment?" Esther asked, smiling faintly. "The best kind I give." They lingered there until the sun dipped low, then started back down the trail. Halfway home, Caleb said, "You never talk much about before." "There isn't much worth telling." "There's always something worth telling," he said. She was quiet a long time before answering. "I had a mother once who made the world feel safe. When she died, the safety went with her. After that, I just tried to stay small enough not to draw fire." Caleb frowned. "You're not small." "Not anymore," she said. "But I used to think maybe if I could be invisible, they'd stop hating me for taking up space." He stopped walking. "They didn't hate you because of your size, Esther. They hated you because you made them see themselves. Weak people despise mirrors." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with truth instead of pity. She nodded once, unable to speak, and they finished the walk in silence that was not uncomfortable. The trouble began a week later. A horse's distant whinny echoed through the trees, unfamiliar, urgent. Caleb's hand went to his rifle before the sound even faded. He looked at Esther. "Stay inside." She obeyed, peering through the window as two riders emerged from the trail. They wore town clothes, wool coats, clean boots, the arrogance of men who had never missed a meal. One of them dismounted and called out, "Cabin belongs to a Caleb Stone?" Caleb stepped out, rifle resting across his forearm. "Who's asking?" "Name Sheriff Barlow. Copper Ridge. I've got questions about a woman gone missing. Esther Pemberton. Folks say she was taken by a man fitting your description." Inside, Esther froze. The name hit her like a blow to the chest. She hadn't expected them to look for her, not after the spectacle, not after the way they'd laughed. But of course, she thought bitterly, they weren't looking out of guilt. There must have been something else. Money, inheritance, appearances. Caleb's voice cut through the wind. "You rode all the way up here for gossip?" "Not gossip," the sheriff said. "Her father claims she was kidnapped during the fair. There's talk of assault, coercion, serious charges, Stone." Caleb's tone stayed even. "The only assault I saw was what her kin did to her in front of half the town." "Maybe so," Barlow said, shifting in his saddle. "But the law's the law. If the girl's here, she needs to come down with me. We'll sort it in town." Caleb took a single step forward. "You're not taking her anywhere against her will." "Then you got nothing to worry about," the sheriff said. "Let her speak for herself." Esther knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She pushed open the door and stepped out, the cold biting her face. "Sheriff," she said, voice steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. "No one took me. I went because I wanted to live." Barlow blinked. "Miss Pemberton?" "My name is Esther," she said firmly. "And if you're here on my father's orders, tell him he's already lost the right to call me daughter." The second man, Barlow's deputy, shifted uneasily. "Ma'am, your family says you're unwell, that this man's got you confused." Caleb's jaw tightened. Esther stepped closer to him, close enough that their sleeves brushed. "He's the only man who's ever told me the truth," she said, "and I'm not confused. I'm free." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment. "You sure about that?" "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." Barlow sighed. "Then you'd best know. Your father's filed claim on your grandmother's estate. Says you're incompetent to manage it. There's money involved, Miss Esther, a lot of it. He'll use the law if he can't use shame." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "That's what this is about, then." Barlow nodded. "I just deliver the messages. My advice? Stay put a while, but he won't stop." The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off. When the sound of hooves faded, Esther turned to Caleb. "He'll come here. You know that." "Yes," Caleb said, "and when he does, he'll find we're not easy prey." That night, the cabin felt smaller, the air heavier. Esther sat by the fire, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't know about the inheritance," she said. "My grandmother, she was kind. She wrote me letters, but my mother always took them before I could read them." Caleb nodded. "They must have hidden it from you." "I should have told you sooner." "You didn't know," he said gently. "None of this is your fault." She looked at him then, eyes bright with worry. "If they come back, they'll try to hurt you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let them try." Silence filled the cabin, thick as the snow outside. Then Caleb spoke again, softer. "I've lost someone before because I couldn't protect her. I won't lose you too." Esther's breath caught. "Caleb," he shook his head. "Rest now. Tomorrow we'll set traps closer to the ridge. I want to know if anyone comes near." She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't afraid for herself, but for him. But instead, she nodded. When she finally lay down, she could still see his silhouette by the window, rifle propped beside him, watching the dark. Outside, the thawed lake creaked and shifted under moonlight. Somewhere down the mountain, a man named Pemberton was already plotting his next move, and in the small cabin by the lake, two souls prepared to fight for the life they had found in the ruins of cruelty. The storm arrived before her father did. Wind screamed through the trees, carrying the smell of snow and smoke. The lake, once thawed, had frozen over again, thin but treacherous, a mirror ready to break. Caleb said it felt like a warning. The mountains had a way of sensing blood before it spilled. 3 nights after the sheriff's visit, Esther woke to the sound of horses, not one or two, but many. She sat up, heart pounding. Outside, shadows moved through the snow, lanterns, torches, and the sharp glint of gunmetal. Caleb was already pulling on his coat. "Stay low. Don't speak unless I tell you." "Caleb!" He turned to her, voice quiet but fierce. "You survived worse than this. Don't let them take that from you now." Through the frosted window, She saw him step into the blizzard like a man stepping into judgment. The wind seized his coat, flung snow into his beard. There were 6 men, maybe 7. At their head, riding a dark horse with a silver bridle, was Richard Pemberton. "Stone!" her father bellowed. "You've got something that belongs to me." Caleb raised his rifle, but not yet aimed. "If you mean your daughter, you're mistaken. You lost her the day you threw her to the pigs." "That fat embarrassment is my blood," Richard snarled, "and she's worth a fortune. So either you hand her over, or we take her, and this cabin too." One of the men laughed, gun already drawn. "Ain't much to take but wood and a woman." Caleb's voice was ice. "You'll take neither." Then came the crack of a rifle. Snow exploded from a post inches from Caleb's shoulder. Esther screamed, running to the doorway. Caleb turned, eyes wide. "Inside, Esther!" But she didn't. She grabbed the second rifle from the wall, loaded just as he'd taught her. Her hands trembled, but not with fear, with purpose. Another shot tore through the night. Caleb returned fire, dropping one man clean off his horse. The others scattered, firing wild. Lantern light flickered, shouts turned frantic. Richard shouted above the chaos, "Don't hit her! She's worth more alive!" Caleb moved like the storm itself, silent, sure, ruthless. He rolled behind the trough, reloaded, and fired again. One of the hired men stumbled, clutching his leg. Another bolted into the trees. Richard dismounted, stalking forward through the snow. "Coward! Hiding behind a woman, are you?" Caleb stood, calm as stone. "No, I'm standing in front of her." Esther from the doorway shouted, "Father, stop this! You'll hang for what you done." He laughed, a terrible broken sound. "I made you, girl. I can unmake you." He raised his pistol. Caleb moved faster. The shot that cracked the air didn't come from Richard. It came from Caleb's rifle. The pistol flew from Richard's hand. He fell backward into the snow, clutching his arm and screaming. The wind carried silence after that. Only the hiss of snow and the low groan of the lake remained. Caleb walked forward, rifle still trained. "Get on your horse, Pemberton. Take whoever's left and ride. Don't come back." Richard spat blood into the snow. "You think this is over? The law?" Caleb's voice cut through him like a blade. "The law had its chance. What you got now is mercy, and it's running out." Richard looked at his daughter. For a moment, just one, his face flickered with something like regret. But then the sneer returned. "You'll regret choosing him, girl. He'll tire of you soon enough." Esther's hands clenched around her rifle. "Maybe," she said softly, "but at least he'd never sell me." Richard paled, jaw tightening. Then he staggered to his feet and limped to his horse. Within minutes, the men were gone, lanterns shrinking into the dark until the mountains swallowed them whole. Caleb lowered his rifle. Snow fell thick around them, muting every sound. Esther stepped forward, tears freezing on her lashes. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, it's beginning." He looked out across the frozen lake where dawn was trying to break through the storm. Then he turned to her, his expression softening. "You stood your ground," he said. "Didn't hide, didn't beg." She smiled through trembling lips. "I learned from the best." Caleb reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering against her cheek. "You're safe now," he said quietly, "and as long as I'm breathing, you always will be." The snow kept falling, soft and endless. Behind them, the cabin glowed like a lantern in the white world, proof that kindness could still stand its ground against cruelty. By morning, the storm had died. leaving the world clean and still. The snow stretched unbroken from the cabin door to the tree line, save for a few shallow prints where the intruders had fled. The sky above the mountains burned pale gold, the kind of light that came only after violence, thin, forgiving, fragile. Caleb stood in the porch, hat in hand, watching steam rise from his breath. The rifle leaned against the wall beside him. Inside, Esther brewed coffee, the smell threading through the cold air like a promise of life returning. She stepped out to join him, wrapped in a blanket. "They won't be back," she said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed. "Men like that only know how to take. Once they fail, they move on to easier prey." She nodded, though her gaze drifted to the horizon where the sun was pushing through the last of the clouds. "I don't hate them," she said after a long silence. "I thought I would, but all I feel is empty, like they're ghosts already." Caleb glanced at her. "Ghosts can't touch you unless you let them." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I won't." They went inside, shutting out the cold. The fire still burned steady in the hearth. The cabin looked the same, yet different, like it had survived a trial and earned the right to keep standing. Esther walked to the window and pressed her palm against the glass. Beyond it, the lake glimmered beneath the sun, and a flock of ravens wheeled across the sky. Caleb came to stand behind her. "You could go back to town if you wanted. The sheriff knows the truth now. You'd be free to claim your grandmother's inheritance. Start again, somewhere else." She turned toward him, shaking her head. "Money never gave me safety or peace. I don't want a world that weighs worth in gold." Her voice softened. "Everything I need is here." Caleb met her gaze for a long time, then nodded once, as if sealing a vow. He reached for her hand. "Then here you'll stay, as long as the mountain'll have us." Outside, the snow began to melt in narrow rivulets, trickling down to the frozen earth. The sound was like quiet applause, life returning, the mountain exhaling. Esther leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think the world will ever change?" she asked. He looked out the window, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not all at once, but every time someone chooses mercy over cruelty, that's a start." The fire cracked softly. She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Then I suppose we've already changed a small piece of it." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "That's enough for me." And as the morning light filled the cabin, the two of them stood together, survivors of a world that had tried to break them, builders of one small corner where kindness had won. The story didn't end there. It simply stayed, quiet as falling snow, certain as spring waiting beneath it. Some stories begin in cruelty, but end in mercy. Esther was thrown to the pigs, but a man who'd lost everything taught her what it meant to be seen again. Caleb wasn't her savior. He was her mirror. Two broken souls who refused to stay that way. If you're listening to this somewhere far from the mountains, London, Manila, Hanoi, or Texas, remember, you are not what they called you when the world was cruel. You are what you build after someone chooses to see your worth. If you still believe love can heal what hatred once broke, then this story was meant for you.